Chapter 12. Angels and Oranges. Shasta and I drove down to Long Beach one late afternoon to look for an apartment. We were going to pick up Lourdes so she could show us the best places to look. She was just excited to get out of the house. She had been on constant mommy patrol for months, damned to the late-night breastfeedings, no sleep, and not getting to go out with friends to get drunk, see bands, or raise the kind of hell she was used to raising. The sun was low in the sky and everything seemed light and airy and orange. But maybe that was just because I was so excited to see Lourdes. She had a way of changing the light in my life, making everything more vibrant, more special. We drove down Ocean Boulevard past where the old Pike used to be. Back in the day, the Pike was a seedy and run-down amusement park that ran along the shore, where sailors and ex-cons would score drugs and hookers and get tattooed in the many parlors that lined the boardwalk. There were saloons, pool halls, brothels, penny arcades, and carnival attractions like old wooden roller coasters, a Ferris wheel, and bumper cars. It was a lively and magical place. But that was all torn down now. They built it all over with a mall, like any other mall. Barnes & Noble Books, Cold Stone Creamery, The Gap, Forever 21, and the like. Boring and banal. Then we passed the Aquarium of the Pacific and the Long Beach Convention Center, where Richard Pryor performed one of his most infamous and hilarious comedy specials in 1979, called Live in Concert, one of my all-time favorites. Though there had been a good deal of modernization along the waterfront, massive glass and steel structures, housing condominiums, hotels, and storefronts, there were still many classic landmark buildings from a more glorious and beautiful time. The old Breakers Hotel, the Art Deco-styled Lafayette Building, the Campbell Apartments, the Broadland, the Cooper Arms, and the green copper spirals of the beautiful French Gothic Villa Riviera on the corner of Ocean and Alamitos Avenue, all of which were built in the 1920s, still standing in all their glory, as were most of the apartment houses and bungalows throughout the Alamitos Beach section of town. Some were old Spanish Californian, some Art Deco, some mid-century modern, the streets copious with bougainvillea, rose bushes, orange and lemon trees, ferns, jasmine, gardenias, shady with palms and Japanese pines. There was a richness to the sunlight, the shadows, and the fresh ocean air. It was a tough old town that had survived fire, floods, and earthquakes. You could feel the ghosts of the rough and rugged souls that founded the city still haunting the hotel lobbies, bars, street corners, and out along the pier, swaying in the gales, blowing through the pillars below. Block by block, I fell deeper and deeper in love with all of it. As we drove further south down Ocean, we passed very old and stately manors as we crossed into Belmont Shores, connecting to the 2nd Street shopping district, where the college crowd communed in douchey sports bars and shopped for cell phones, workout gear, laptops, and sneakers. There were many restaurants and ice cream parlors and candy shops as well. Then we crossed a small bridge onto Naples Island, parking in front of Lourdes's and the butcher's house. It was an opulent estate, well-sculpted hedges and lawn, big white double doors, and a large backyard that went right down to the water. It was impressive. I turned in my seat in envy. We rang Lourdes to let her know we were waiting outside. I'd rather chop off a limb than go inside and have a meet and greet with the butcher. She came bounding out the front door with a big, gleeful grin plastered on her face. She was dressed to the nines, like she was headed out to a club or something. Penciled skirt, sheer black top tied across her chest, high heels, red scarf around her neck, hair tied back in a ponytail, lips glossy and red, her baby weight totally gone. She looked as vivacious and sexy as the first time I laid eyes on her a dozen years prior, and she still, quite literally, took my breath away. I looked at Shasta, who sat waving to Lourdes as she came down the driveway to the car. She looked even more wretched than normal in comparison. Lourdes climbed in the back, though I would have preferred to have her sit up front and had Shasta back there. "What's up, you guys? So good to see you, Shasta," said Lourdes. They hadn't seen each other in a long time. "Damn, girl, you going to a dance or to a drag race in that getup? You look outstanding. Are we underdressed?" I said, leering at every inch of her luscious frame. "Ha ha, no. But we're going to hit up some bars at least. I've been stuck in the house under lock and key for months, and I am ready to cut loose," she exclaimed. Shasta lit up and reached back to high-five her. Any opportunity to get fucked up was a challenge Shasta was always willing to undertake. We drove down Broadway into the heart of Alamitos Beach. Lourdes was right. It was the hip part of town. The residents were young, tattooed, punk rock, gay, some ex-con types, some gangsters, lots of weed dispensaries, vintage clothing shops, record stores, galleries, bookstores, coffee shops, dive bars. Very lively, lots of culture, lots of cool. And she was right again. Every other building had a for rent sign in front of it, block after block. It seemed that the problem wasn't going to be finding a place, but which place to choose from. I saw a few dozen places I'd be more than happy to live in just within those few blocks. Lourdes showed us where all the rental offices in the neighborhood were along 4th Street, and we wrote down the addresses of a few spots we really liked. We were both excited about moving there. It was a real place. A blood and guts place. A beer and wine and weed and cocaine place. It was tattoos and shotguns and surfboards and rock and roll. And it was right over the Vincent Thomas Bridge from San Pedro and Ports o' Call. Long Beach was the place to be, and cheap. It was probably the last affordable beachside city in Southern California. Afterwards, we decided to get a drink at the V-Room, a favorite dive bar for many of the locals in the neighborhood. I gave Shasta a few bucks to throw into the jukebox. I knew how indecisive she could be, and knew choosing a bunch of songs would take her a good long while. That, coupled with her constant nodding off, would give Lourdes and I ample time to catch up, one-on-one, face-to-face. But I was suddenly very uncomfortable as I squeezed into the booth across from her. My stomach was so huge I could barely fit. I was struggling to breathe and started sweating. She could tell how uncomfortable I was and asked, "Do you want to sit at the bar instead?" I was so embarrassed. No, I'm fine. This is nice," I said falsely, posing and trying to look cool. What I meant was it was nice and dark in that booth, and I'd be damned if I was going to sit at the more illuminated bar and have her sit next to me looking at my side profile, which was like looking at an oil barrel wearing pants. No way. My ass wasn't leaving that nice dark booth until we were ready to leave, no matter how tight the squeeze. Not that it mattered much in reality. It was painfully obvious to anyone who had known me for as long as she did that I had become morbidly obese and was seriously unhealthy. I thought back to how I looked that night in my room at the hotel when she kept inviting me in bed with her. How strong and lean I was then. How I suspect I was a tantalizing prospect to her back in those days. And now, how there was no way she saw me in that light anymore. Made me wish all the lights in the bar would just go out. Still, I reveled in the light of her presence, her menacing smile, her sharp wit, her shiny dark eyes, the banter that only her and I had. "So how the hell are you?" she asked. "Great. Living the life. It's pretty awesome." What shit. What a phony-ass lie. She wasn't stupid. She knew there was no way I could be telling the truth, looking how I did. Working as a truck driver, dating Shasta. And I had the audacity to sit there and lie to her face. What was I thinking? But she was gracious and just nodded with a polite smile. "How about you? How is it being a domesticated mommy?" I asked. I was taken by surprise at her response. She kind of shrugged and looked down at the table and then into my eyes and sort of shook her head. "Well, I love being a mommy. The baby is amazing. I can't wait for you to meet her. But relationships, well, let's just say they're always challenging. Very fucking challenging," she said, rolling her eyes. Oh shit. Sorry to hear that." No, I fucking wasn't. I was over the moon to hear that, quite frankly. But I sat and listened, trying to seem concerned. "It's no big deal, but it's just that Ken kind of changed after I got pregnant. He used to lavish me with gifts and take me out to nice dinners and shopping and vacations. But since the baby, he's kind of become a fucking cheapskate. And if he's had a bad day at the butcher shop, he comes home all grumpy and pissy. It's such a drag. Not as much fun as being single, that's for sure. But Luna makes it all worth it." My emotions were all over the place. Even though I was happy to hear that she was dissatisfied with her relationship, I was still concerned with her happiness and well-being. My heart soared hearing about her joy of being a mother, and saw her in a brand new light as such. She still exuded that bad girl, gun mall vibe, but there was another dimension to her now. A warmer, caring, nurturing side I never fathomed I'd see in her. I cheered her up with some tales of my mad, fumbling adventures. She laughed and poked fun at my misery, which I found hilarious. She also gave me a lot of insight, reminding me that it was my best thinking that got me where I was, that I was completely responsible for my situation, and that it was also my choice to take action to change it. "I guess that's true for both of us, right?" I said. She rolled her eyes again and nodded. "Yeah, fucking ain't right. I should take my own advice sometimes." We just smiled. We still had that deep understanding of each other, even after all these years. Shasta came stumbling over and screeched, "Woohoo! Fucking Long Beach, bitches!" spilling her drink all over the table. The pills and the booze were a bad mix with her. She was sloshed on a few beers. I had to get her home. We dropped Lourdes back at her place and headed south down Pacific Coast Highway. I wanted to drive along the shore, past all my favorite surf spots from my youth. My friends and I would take the bus from Fullerton down to Huntington Beach to surf the river jetties. It was a spot right on the border between Newport and Huntington, where you could surf all day in the summer, when the rest of the beach was blackballed, which meant too many people in the water to surf safely. As we rolled down the highway, watching the waves crashing and the sun setting in the west, Shasta decided it was the right time to come clean with me about something. "So look, I'm super stoked that we're moving in together, but I need you to know something, and I don't want you to get pissed. I want you to try and understand. It's not Vicodin I'm addicted to, it's heroin. I'm pretty fucking strung out right now, and after we move in, I may need you to take me to a detox center. Best I can say is I'm really fucking sick of it, and I want to get clean and start over. I just wanted to be honest with you because we're going to be living together now, and I think it's only fair you know what's going on. And also, I have Hep C." Again, my emotions were shooting like shotgun blasts in every given direction. I was pissed, first of all. Heroin is not fucking Vicodin, though they were both opioids and both ruined people's lives. There were just too many pitfalls to slamming shit in your veins, something so much uglier and detrimental to it all. Secondly, I was terribly sad for her. I had been around men with addictions, but being a woman with hardly anyone to support her through such things, was in a very desperate and vulnerable position. Still, as if sex wasn't already off the table, her having Hep C really sealed the deal. I saw her as nothing more than a roommate from that point on. Lastly, I just felt foolish. I had no idea. There were no tracks on her arms. I asked her about this. She said she'd been shooting it between her toes. I was fuming. She had been doing this around my sister and niece and right under my nose. I had to admit, she was pretty discreet because none of us had any clue. I decided I'd do what I could to help her. What choice did I have at this point anyway? We had already made the decision to move. My sister and niece were already packing. We had to start applying for places as soon as possible and made plans to return to Long Beach in a day or two to start the process. Out of the frying pan and into the fire, I suppose. We found something the first day of looking. A nice one-bedroom on 2nd Street between Orange and Esperanza, just 2 blocks from the beach. It was only $800 a month. There was a Mexican restaurant, a bar, a little donut shop, and a 7-Eleven on the corner, and just a couple of short miles away from Lourdes over in Naples. It was a nice, open space with a bedroom that rivaled the living room in size. It had a large window looking down on the courtyard above the few garages the building provided. The garages were in high demand because parking in Long Beach, and I cannot emphasize this enough, is an absolute shit show. During the day you could find plenty of spots, but after 5 p.m., you were completely fucked. But the garages weren't free with the price of rent. You had to pay $150 extra for the privilege. The parking was so bad, in fact, I had to find a new home for my 51 Chevy Juanita. I couldn't even fit her into any of those garages. They were too small, and I sure as hell couldn't leave her on the street. I'd have to move her from one side of the street to the other on street cleaning days, and she didn't even run to begin with. Luckily, my mom had a friend at work that was a car enthusiast and offered to take her for safekeeping at his place in 29 Palms. As much as it pained me, I helped him load her onto his car hauler one morning and felt my stomach turn as he pulled Juanita away. I hoped like hell I'd get to drive her again someday. We figured we'd splurge since we were both saving a ton of money splitting the rent and leased one of the garages to avoid the hassle of looking for parking in the evening. It was nice to be able to afford the option. I went from paying $1,100 a month to a mere $400, which freed up a whole lot of cash for me, something I'd not had in a very long time. I'd actually be able to sock some cash away into savings. We'd be able to eat better, buy some new clothes, and get some new furniture. Doesn't seem like much to most people, but for us, it was amazing. Just those few simple things made all the difference. We decided to hire some migrant workers from a Home Depot to move our stuff. For one, we could afford to, and I was just too tired from working all the time to take it on, and Shasta was too strung out. I drove to our local Home Depot. When the migrants saw me pull up, they rushed the car and started fighting with each other to get in. The car shook as they slammed each other around for a chance at the job. A couple of the squirreliest hombres made their way in, and I hit the accelerator like I was fleeing some banana republic that was just overthrown by commie guerrilla fighters. The economy was still in such ruin. People were desperate and willing to do anything for a buck, especially these people. I offered them $100 each. We didn't have all that much to move after all. It would only be a one-trip, one-load deal. They eagerly accepted. It was the 4th of July, and we watched the fireworks from the Queen Mary exploding overhead as the workers loaded our things into our new home. I bought them a 12-pack, some takeout Chinese food, and gave them a little extra cash for not breaking anything. It was money well spent because before I knew it, we were all moved in and we barely had to lift a finger. We settled in nicely and spent a few days getting to know the neighborhood, taking long walks along the beach, eating breakfast at the park pantry diner, walking Mona through Bigsby Park, and meeting our neighbors and having a barbecue with them in the courtyard downstairs. And just like that, we were LBC locals. Not 3 weeks after moving in, Shasta got laid off from her job at the department store. She wasn't worried, though. Her bosses told her she'd be able to collect unemployment, which she was able to do. And she wasn't making a whole lot less than she was when she was working because she had never collected before. She was thrilled because it meant not having to do anything but get high and play with Mona all day. I wasn't so lucky. I'd have to get up even earlier to get to work because I was living a little further out from the distribution center in Santa Ana. So most days I was leaving a good hour before the sun was up. I'd get dressed and watch Shasta asleep in bed, snoring away. I'd get home long after the sun went down and find her in the exact same position, not sure if she had even moved an inch the whole day. Not that it bothered me much. The less I'd have to deal with her, the better I felt. It was pretty much like living alone. She was unconscious most of the time. When she was awake, I'd take her for drives around the city just to get to know the area and also to help her clear her head, remind her she was still a member of the living. While we lived in a very gentrified, more or less safe part of Long Beach, there were areas just a few blocks east of us that were pretty fucking scary. North Long Beach was mostly black and Mexican, very close to Compton, and known for being infested by very active gangs. The most notorious being the Rolling 20s Long Beach Crips, Snoop Dogg's old set. But the white boys in Long Beach were no joke either, and their close ties to Huntington Beach gangs like P9 Death Squad, which started in the hardcore punk rock scene in the early 80s. The city was extraordinarily diverse, though. There was a large Cambodian population as well. Buddhist temples and schools were very common in those communities. We'd see monks draped in orange and burgundy robes walking in humble strides down the block, blissful smiles and friendly waves. Some days I'd drive her and Mona over the Vincent Thomas Bridge into San Pedro and up to the Korean Bell in Angels Gate Park. It was a massive bronze bell housed in a stone and tile pagoda-styled pavilion, sitting on top of a promontory that was once part of Fort MacArthur. The view of the Pacific from up there was unsurpassed. We let Mona off her leash, and she'd run across the lawn in giant circles, her eyes wide and joyful. Shasta would come alive and laugh and chase her around. But her liveliness wouldn't last long. She'd go long weeks not doing much more than shooting up, eating bad food, and sleeping 14 to 18 hours a day. I became quite lonely and bored. I didn't have my mom, sister, and niece around to talk to after work anymore, and Shasta was checked out nearly all the time. I talked to Lourdes on the phone, but the butcher was a needy cunt and kept her locked down most of the time. I needed something to do. I had kept up with my writing, scratching down poems and short stories on the backs of fast food receipts and in notebooks while waiting in the loading docks. I'd come home and enter them into Word documents on my computer. But that didn't seem like enough. I wanted a big project, something that leapt off the page, something I had never attempted before. For a long time I had been thinking about my father. Maybe it was finding myself in the same profession that he had worked and imagining him as my co-pilot, riding alongside me down those dark desert roads the way we had when I was a boy. I thought of his youth and his stories of him and his brothers being the local Casanovas, cruising the streets of Belmont Shores in the summer, tanning on the beach right down the road from where I now lived. How he was once young and strong and breaking hearts at every turn, and how he died penniless and unfulfilled in the end. I remember once when I was around 12 years old, he had a friend who was a pilot. He owned a little Cessna and offered to give my father flying lessons. He took me along for a lesson. We took off from the Long Beach airport. We soared high above the port and out over the ocean, along the very shoreline where I now resided. My father taking the wheel and veering us out over the blue water, Catalina down below, downtown Long Beach, the harbor, just a boy and his father, young and daring, me leering down at it all, not knowing that my future was down there somewhere, some fateful moment in time, a place, awaiting my arrival. I tried for years to escape my past, who I was, where I was from, who I was from, but it was like some kind of vortex that drew me to the same stomping grounds of my forefathers. My grandfather working as a grocery clerk at the Grand Central Market in downtown L.A. in the 40s, where I later spent many days shopping with nothing more than nickels and dimes in my pocket and eating burritos for lunch after working all morning in the California Plaza. Echo Park, where my mother's family lived until she was 8 years old, where I wrote my first published stories and where I caught the bus every day on Echo Park Avenue when I didn't have a car. Now Long Beach, where my father and his brothers spent carefree summer afternoons, basking in the sun, beautiful brown beach bunnies wrapped around their fingers, stoned on Mexican reefer, drunk on cold bottles of Michelob beer, dancing on the sand to Link Ray. Me having worked as a store clerk like my grandfather, working as a truck driver like my father, stuck in the same circle, the same working class status, as if assigned and expected to live out my days the way they had, here in California, our land, our place in the sun. My father died with nothing, leaving us little in his passing. He left me some gold rings. That was it. The only artifacts he left us, the only history about our family, was a well-preserved collection of family photos, some very old, that he kept in a number of family albums that he spent a great deal of time putting together. When I was young, I used to pore over them for hours on end, asking him who all the people were and when the pictures were taken. We spent a lot of time bonding over our family history. But after he died, and my stepmother and little brother moved around over the years, they were lost. My mother also collected a plethora of family photos going back to our migrant beginnings, but she too stored them away somewhere and sort of forgot where. These were great stories of how both sides of the family came to California and how they built their lives here. Maybe it was my age. Maybe it was landing in Long Beach on the border of Orange and LA counties, where so much of my story and the story of my people in this country originated. I don't know, but I had an epiphany that these stories had to be told, not in the written word, but through a film. I was going to make a documentary about my family. Maybe it was reconciliation, some way of coming to terms with who I was, who they all were, and at the same time who anyone was that came from these streets, the working class people of California, Los Angeles, Orange County. I decided I'd call it Angels and Oranges. The first thing I had to do was find the photos. I called my brother and asked him and his mother to look for them. He seemed dubious. He or his mother had no idea where they were. They had to be in storage, but they had a few storage facilities in a few locations, and they didn't know which one of those the photo albums were in, or if they even still had them. But he promised they'd look. I called my mother next and set her and the rest of the family to find as many pictures of the family as they could. Then I called my Aunt Doll, my father's sister, though she too had her doubts. She knew there were a lot of old photos and documents that my grandmother left behind, but she hadn't laid hands or eyes on them for a couple of decades. I was a bit frustrated. These were the only remnants of our family history, and they were just socked away somewhere, rotting. No one seemed to care. Fact of the matter was, I hadn't even seen a picture of my father since he died in 1995, much less shared stories about him with the family, or got any insight from them on his life or the history of the rest of our lineage. It took a fair amount of prodding and several months before I got any results, but everyone found the pictures they had stored away. They all came through with flying colors. I had to trek out to Laguna Beach to get the pictures from my stepmother, at which time she decided to tell me I had a stray brother out there somewhere in the world that my father didn't want us to know about until he passed. It didn't shock me. Knowing what a pussy hound the old man was, there were probably many unknown siblings I had wandering the earth. Then she gave me a clothes hamper full of photo albums, the ones I remembered from my youth. But I was just getting started. Then I drove out to Lake Elsinore to get 2 more big boxes of photos that my mother and her siblings collected for the project. Then another short hop over to Canyon Lake, just a few short miles from my mom's to my Aunt Doll's place. She dumped 2 giant storage tubs on me, filled to the brim with photos. My grandfather's immigration papers, my grandparents' wedding in Chicago, paintings he made, even photos of him coming over on the boat from Bari. It was a treasure trove. I had the makings of my film. It was my new mission, something to distract from my dissatisfaction, my way of making amends with the past and building a road to a new future. I lugged box after box of photos up the stairs into our place, stacking them on the kitchen table. My father's photo albums were still intact, well organized and exactly as I remembered them from my youth. But the storage tubs my aunt gave me were a disheveled mess. Pictures, documents, albums, slides, all crammed and shoved into the hilt, dense and daunting. Shasta and I sorted through them as I tried to remember who the people in the photos were. I knew some, but had to struggle with the names of others. As I sifted through, wheels started to turn in my head as to how to piece together a story from these photographs. But there was clearly a lot of history in them that I simply knew nothing about. And that was painful, because the photos were so lovely and intriguing. Some of them were so old and moldering, they would crumble when you tried to pick them up. The stories were there, but what were they? I didn't want to make them up as I went along. I wanted authenticity. I needed some kind of chronicler, an oracle to the past that could help me bring these stories to life. And my family didn't really know much more than I already knew. It just didn't seem like enough of an oral history to make a whole movie out of. I was stumped. Weeks came and went. The boxes of photographs were sitting on the kitchen table gathering dust. It wasn't as if we ever used the table for meals. I ate out on the road, and whatever food Shasta could microwave between 12-hour naps, she'd eat on the couch in front of the television. I was frustrated on so many levels. All the effort I put into gathering these pictures seemed superfluous without any authentic substance to bring them to life. I was at an impasse. But then something quite, and I hate to use this word, miraculous happened. I was off to work early one morning, feeling pretty good because it was a warm summer morning, and the sun was out when I got in the car for a change, as I was assigned a load that wasn't scheduled to leave until 8 a.m., which was still early, but not nearly as bad as one scheduled for my usual 5 a.m. I noticed I was low on gas and headed down 2nd Street toward the Chevron on the corner of 2nd and Alamitos. Our street was pretty quiet that time of day. Most people were still sound asleep or just getting up, and there was no one walking or riding their bikes down the bike lane on this morning, except for one slight, blurry figure making its way toward me on the right side of the street. As I got closer, I made out a thin, gray-skinned old man. Silver hair, long and feathered back, silver outlaw jailbird brush of a mustache, carrying 2 big bags of groceries from the Vons that sat just on the other side of Alamitos. As I got closer still, I made out his face. God damn, that old dude looks just like my father had he lived to get old. I thought to myself. Then, like a ton of bricks dropping on my head, it hit me. Holy shit, if that isn't my Uncle Robert, I shouted. I was astounded. I didn't stop. I had to get gassed up and on the freeway to get to work on time. And knowing what I knew about Robert, I wasn't about to open that can of worms without preparing myself first. Uncle Robert was my father's oldest brother. He had spent the majority of his life behind bars for petty crimes, theft mostly, to support his lifelong addiction to heroin. His addiction had wreaked havoc on most anyone he came in contact with, including his own family, who had shunned him after years of dealing with his constant lies and deception. My father hated him. What was also perplexing is that he had to live close to me. Why else would he be walking down a residential street carrying 2 full bags of groceries unless he lived somewhere nearby? I drove to work with my head spinning. Later in the day, while waiting to get unloaded, I called my Uncle Billy, who was my father's next oldest brother, and asked him, "Hey man, where the hell is Robert living these days?" "Shit, I'm not sure, man. I haven't talked to him in a long time, but I think he's somewhere in Long Beach," he said. "You should call him, man. I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from you. I got his number." "Well, do me a favor and give him a ring and ask him where he's staying and let me know, but I think he lives somewhere near me." He said he'd get in touch as soon as he found out. It didn't take long. Uncle Billy called me that night and told me that he spoke to Uncle Robert and that he lived on Broadway just on the other side of Orange, a half block away from my place. I could throw a rock from my front door and hit his window. In the 51.5 square miles that make up the city of Long Beach, with a population of close to 470,000 people, my Uncle Robert lived less than 80 yards away from me. I got his number from Billy and called him. His voice was a raspy, slippery hiss with a very distinctive accent, one that only people from California who had grown up around ex-cons would recognize. "Shit! What the hell, Bambino? You moved into my hood and didn't have the decency to look me up, you little bugger?" he shouted jokingly. "Come on over, old man. I got something you just gotta see." I waited for him at the front gate. He came down the street wearing an oversized Raiders parka with the hoodie up over his head. He was gaunt and slender. "What the hell you been eating, youngster?" he said, looking at what a massive pig I had become. He hadn't seen me since my grandmother's funeral 12 years prior. I'd packed on some serious weight since then. He gave me a big hug, though. He smelled the same way Crow did: cigarettes, sweat, and unwashed clothes. I took him upstairs and introduced him to Shasta. They recognized each other, not because they had ever met, but because one junkie can spot another on sight in seconds, like they'd recognize their own reflection in the mirror. "So what is it you just had to show me, youngster?" he asked, looking around the room, sizing up what he might be able to steal. I pointed to the table and told him to open the boxes. He did, saw the photos, and fell silent. Suddenly, all the jailhouse bravado and jive talk went away. He turned to me with tears in his eyes. "I never thought I'd ever see these faces again. There's Uncle Junie, Auntie Mary, there's our house in Norwalk when we first moved in, and there's Auntie Lil and Papa and Grandpa Vito. Thank you, youngster. I'm home again." It looked as though I had found my oracle to the past.